The gunshot echoed through the Colorado mountains just as Franklin Hayes dismounted his horse, and he knew immediately that someone was in terrible trouble. It was late September in 1878, and the aspen trees blazed golden against the deep blue sky above the Rocky Mountains. Franklin had been checking his trap lines in the high country near his cabin when the sound cracked through the thin mountain air. He was a solitary man by nature, having left his family's ranch in Texas 3 years ago after his father died and his brothers took over the operation. At 27 years old, he had built himself a life of quiet independence in these mountains, trading furs and occasionally guiding hunting parties to make his living. But that gunshot changed everything. He tied his horse to a pine tree and moved cautiously through the dense forest, his rifle ready but not raised. The sound had come from somewhere near Copper Creek, about a mile from his cabin. As he made his way through the underbrush, he heard voices, rough and angry. "Should have just left her with the wagon," one man said. "Dead weight now," another replied. "Boss said no witnesses. She saw too much." Franklin crept closer until he could see two men on horseback riding away from a small clearing. They wore dusty trail clothes and had the hard look of outlaws. He waited until they disappeared down the mountain trail before moving into the clearing they had left. What he found made his blood run cold. A young woman lay crumpled at the base of an old cottonwood tree, her dress torn and dirty, her face pale as death. At first he thought she had been shot, but as he knelt beside her, he realized the gunshot must have been a warning, or perhaps they had shot at something else. She was breathing barely, but she was not bleeding from any wound. Instead, she looked like she had not eaten in days, perhaps weeks. Her cheekbones jutted sharply from her face, her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her arms were nothing but skin and bone. "Miss," he said softly, touching her shoulder. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered but did not open. He checked her pulse and found it weak and thready. Without hesitation, Franklin scooped her up in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, light as a child despite being a grown woman. He carried her back to where he had left his horse, then carefully mounted with her cradled against his chest. The ride back to his cabin took nearly an hour, and she did not wake once during the journey. His cabin was small but well built, constructed of thick logs with a stone fireplace and a single large room that served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom. He laid her gently on his bed, the only real bed in the place, and covered her with heavy quilts. Then he built up the fire and put water on to boil. Franklin had some experience with illness and injury. Living alone in the mountains demanded a certain level of self-sufficiency, and he had treated his own ailments and injuries many times. But this was different. This woman was starving, and he knew that feeding her too much too quickly could kill her as surely as the starvation itself. He made a thin broth from dried venison and gave her small sips when he could rouse her enough to swallow. Most of it dribbled down her chin, but some went down her throat. He did this every hour through the night, never sleeping, just watching her breathe and trying to get whatever nourishment he could into her body. By morning, her color was slightly better, though she still had not truly awakened. Franklin examined her more carefully in the daylight. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with dark auburn hair that had once been beautiful but was now matted and filthy. Her hands were delicate but showed signs of hard work, with calluses and old scars. She wore a simple cotton dress that had once been blue but was now stained and torn. No jewelry, no possessions of any kind that he could see. He spent the second day much as he had spent the night, giving her broth every hour and keeping her warm. He also heated water and carefully cleaned her face and hands, trying to restore some small measure of dignity. On his own, he found himself talking to her as he worked, telling her about the mountains, about the weather, about his horse and the various animals he had seen that week. It seemed important somehow to fill the silence, to remind her, if she could hear him at all, that she was not alone. On the third day, her eyes opened. Franklin was sitting beside the bed, whittling a piece of wood when he felt her gaze on him. He looked up to find her staring at him with eyes the color of dark honey, wide with fear and confusion. "Easy now," he said gently, setting aside his knife and wood. "You are safe. My name is Franklin Hayes. I found you in the woods 3 days ago. You were in a bad way, but you are safe now." She tried to speak, but her voice came out as nothing more than a croak. He held a cup of water to her lips, and she drank greedily until he pulled it away. "Not too much at once," he said. "Your stomach needs to remember how to work again." "Who?" she managed, her voice barely audible. "Who were they?" "I do not know," Franklin said honestly. "I heard them ride away. They mentioned a wagon and a boss, but I did not see their faces clearly." "Do you remember what happened?" Tears welled in her eyes and she closed them. "They killed everyone, the whole wagon train, everyone but me." Franklin felt his jaw tighten. Wagon train massacres were not unheard of, though they were more common with Indian attacks than white outlaws. But these had clearly been white men, and they had clearly been murderers. "How did you survive?" he asked. "I hid," she whispered. "Under the wagon, covered myself with supplies. They thought they killed everyone, but I was hiding. When they left, I ran. I ran for days. No food. No water after the first day, just running." "You are safe now," Franklin repeated. "They are gone, and you are safe here." She opened her eyes again and looked at him with an intensity that surprised him. "Why did you help me?" The question caught him off guard. "Because you needed help," he said simply. "What else would I do?" She studied his face for a long moment, then seemed to relax slightly. "Thank you," she breathed. "Thank you." "What is your name?" he asked. "Margaret," she said. "Margaret Anderson." "Well, Miss Anderson, you need to rest and eat. We will talk more when you are stronger." Over the following days, Franklin nursed Margaret back from the edge of death with a patience and gentleness he had not known he possessed. He started with thin broths and weak teas, then gradually introduced soft foods like porridge and mashed potatoes. He cooked every meal with care, seasoning each dish lightly and serving small portions that would not overwhelm her damaged system. Margaret slept most of the first week, waking only to eat and use the chamber pot he had discreetly provided behind a privacy screen he rigged up in the corner. She was deeply embarrassed by her dependence on him, but Franklin treated her with such matter-of-fact kindness that she slowly began to accept his help. As she grew stronger, they began to talk more. Margaret told him about her life before the massacre. She had been traveling from Missouri to California with her aunt and uncle and their 3 children. Her parents had died of cholera 2 years earlier, and she had been living with her mother's sister ever since. The family had sold their farm and decided to try their luck in California, hoping for a better life. "We were 2 weeks out from Denver," she said, her voice growing stronger each day. "There were 6 wagons in our party. We thought we were being careful, taking the safer routes. But these men, they came out of nowhere. At first we thought they wanted to rob us, but they just started shooting. They killed the men first, then the women, the children." Her voice broke. "I heard little Emma screaming, and then she just stopped." Franklin sat beside her bed, his hands clenched into fists. "I am sorry," he said. "I am so sorry that happened to you." "Why?" Margaret asked, looking at him with those penetrating honey-colored eyes. "Why would anyone do that? We had almost nothing of value, just our lives and our dreams." "Some men are just evil," Franklin said quietly. "I wish I had a better answer, but I do not." They sat in silence for a while, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the cabin. Finally, Margaret spoke again. "What will I do now?" she asked. I have no family left, no money, nothing. First, you will get well, Franklin said firmly. Then we will figure out the rest. As the days turned into weeks, Margaret grew steadily stronger. Franklin continued to prepare every meal for her, each one carefully crafted to rebuild her strength without overwhelming her system. He made stews rich with meat and vegetables from his root cellar. He baked bread and taught her to spread it with butter and wild honey. He made her eggs from the chickens he kept in a small coop behind the cabin and served them with fried potatoes and thick slices of bacon. She marveled at his cooking skills, unexpected in a man who lived alone in the mountains. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" she asked one morning as she ate scrambled eggs that were somehow both fluffy and rich. Franklin shrugged, a slight smile playing at his lips. "When you live alone, you either learn to cook or you eat poorly. I decided I would rather eat well." Margaret laughed, and Franklin realized it was the first time he had heard her laugh. The sound was like music, bright and clear and full of life. Something in his chest tightened at the sound, though he did not allow himself to think too much about what that meant. As Margaret regained her strength, she insisted on helping around the cabin. At first, Franklin resisted, worried she would overdo it and relapse. But she was determined, and he found he could not deny her. She started by washing dishes after meals, then moved on to sweeping the floors and doing laundry. Within 3 weeks of waking up, she was moving around the cabin almost normally, though she tired easily and still had a long way to go to fully recover her health. One morning in mid-October, Franklin came in from checking his traps to find Margaret making breakfast. She had figured out how to work his cast iron stove and was frying bacon and making coffee. The sight of her standing in his kitchen, her hair tied back with a piece of ribbon he had given her, wearing a clean dress he had ridden down to the trading post to buy for her, did something to his heart that he could not quite explain. "You should not be doing this," he said, though his tone was gentle. "You need to rest." "I have been resting for 3 weeks," Margaret replied, not turning from the stove. "If I rest any more, I will go mad. Besides, you have done everything for me. It is time I started doing something for you." "You do not owe me anything," Franklin said. Now she did turn, her eyes serious. "I owe you my life, Franklin Hayes. That is not a small thing." He shook his head. "You do not owe me anything," he repeated. "Any decent person would have done the same." "Maybe," Margaret said, "but you did it. You are the one who found me, who brought me here, who has fed me every single meal and asked for nothing in return. That means something." Franklin found he had no response to that, so he simply sat down at the table and let her serve him breakfast. The bacon was perfectly crisp and the coffee was strong and hot. They ate together in comfortable silence, and Franklin realized that sometime over the past 3 weeks, he had gotten used to having her here. The cabin no longer felt empty and silent. It felt like a home. After breakfast, Franklin announced that he needed to go into town for supplies. The nearest town was a small settlement called Oatman, Colorado, about 15 miles down the mountain. It was little more than a trading post, a saloon, a general store, and a handful of houses, but it was where Franklin did most of his business. "I will come with you," Margaret said immediately. Franklin hesitated. "It is a long ride and you are not fully recovered yet." "I am strong enough to sit on a horse," Margaret said firmly. "And I need to know what my options are. I cannot stay here forever, Franklin. You have your own life to live." The thought of her leaving made Franklin's chest ache, but he knew she was right. She could not stay in his one-room cabin indefinitely. It was not proper, and beyond that, she deserved a chance to build her own life. "All right," he agreed. "But we take it slow, and if you get tired, we stop." Margaret smiled at him, and he felt that tightness in his chest again. They rode to Oatman together on a cool October morning. the aspens now mostly bare and the first hints of winter in the air. Margaret rode Franklin's spare horse, an older mare named Daisy who had a gentle temperament. Franklin watched Margaret carefully throughout the ride, ready to stop at any sign of fatigue, but she sat her horse well and seemed to enjoy being outdoors after weeks in the cabin. Oatman was quiet when they arrived, just a few people moving between the buildings. Franklin tied their horses outside the general store and helped Margaret down from her saddle. He noticed how light she still was, though she had gained some weight over the past weeks. She still had a long way to go to fully recover. Inside the store, the proprietor, a man named George Hendricks, looked up from his ledger and broke into a smile when he saw Franklin. "Franklin Hayes. Haven't seen you in a month or more. Thought maybe a bear got you." Then his eyes landed on Margaret and his expression changed to one of curiosity. "And who might this be?" "This is Miss Margaret Anderson," Franklin said. "She had some trouble on the trail. I am helping her get back on her feet." George's wife, Martha, emerged from the back room and her eyes widened when she saw Margaret. "Oh, you poor dear. You look half-starved. George, get her a chair." "Franklin Hayes, what have you been doing to this girl?" "I have been helping her," Franklin said, a bit defensively. "She has been ill." Martha fussed over Margaret, bringing her water and asking 100 questions. Margaret, to her credit, answered patiently, though she did not mention the massacre. She simply said her wagon train had run into trouble and she had gotten separated from her family. While Martha tended to Margaret, Franklin spoke quietly with George. "I need to find out if there is any work in town," he said. "Something suitable for a young woman. She needs to be able to support herself." George scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Not much call for women's work around here," he admitted. "Martha could maybe use some help in the store, but we could not pay much. There is the saloon, but that is no place for a decent woman." Franklin's jaw tightened. "No, not the saloon." "Might be she could do washing and mending," George suggested. "Lots of miners and trappers around here who would pay for clean clothes and repairs. Or she could try her hand at teaching if she has any education. The town has been talking about starting a school." Franklin filed these suggestions away to discuss with Margaret later. He purchased the supplies he needed, and then he and Margaret walked around the small town so she could get a sense of the place. "It is not much," Franklin said apologetically, "but it is a decent town. The people here are mostly honest." "It is fine," Margaret said. She paused by the window of the general store looking at her reflection in the glass. "I look terrible," she said softly. Franklin looked at her. It was true that she was still thin and pale, her dress hanging loose on her frame. But he also saw the strength in her eyes, the determination in the set of her jaw. And he saw her beauty, the fine bones of her face, the rich color of her hair in the sunlight. "You look like someone who survived something impossible," he said. "You look strong." Margaret turned to him, and there was something in her eyes that made his breath catch. "I feel strong when I am with you," she said quietly. "You make me feel safe." Franklin did not know what to say to that, so he simply offered her his arm and they walked back to the horses together. The ride back to the cabin was slower than the ride down, as Margaret was beginning to tire. But she did not complain, and when they finally reached the cabin as the sun was setting, she dismounted on her own and helped Franklin unsaddle the horses. That night, Franklin made venison stew with dumplings, one of his specialties. They ate by the firelight, and Margaret asked him about his life, about how he had ended up living alone in these mountains. Franklin found himself telling her things he had not spoken about in years. About his father's death, about feeling like he did not belong at the family ranch anymore, about the need to find his own way in the world, about the peace he had found in these mountains, the satisfaction of living by his own skills and wits. "You ever get lonely?" Margaret asked. Franklin considered the question. "I did not think I did," he said slowly. "I was content with my own company, but now—" He trailed off, not sure how to finish that sentence. "But now," Margaret prompted gently. "Now I am not so sure," Franklin admitted. "These past weeks, having you here, it has been different. Good different." Margaret set down her spoon and looked at him seriously. "Franklin, I need to know something. What do you want from me? Why are you doing all this?" The question was direct and deserved an honest answer. Franklin thought about it for a moment before responding. "When I found you, you were dying," he said. "I could not just leave you there. And once I brought you here, I could not do anything halfway. You needed care, so I cared for you. As for what I want from you, I want nothing except to see you well and safe. Whether you stay or go, that is up to you. But I will not pretend I have not come to care for you, Margaret. You have brought something into this cabin, into my life, that I did not even know was missing." Margaret's eyes shimmered with tears. "I care for you too," she whispered. "I know it has only been a few weeks, and I know I am still recovering and my mind might not be fully clear. But Franklin, when I look at you, I see a good man, the best man I have ever known. And I find myself hoping that maybe I do not have to leave, that maybe I could stay." Franklin's heart was pounding in his chest. "Stay," he repeated. "If you want me to," Margaret said. "I know this is your home, your space. And I know it is not proper for an unmarried woman to live alone with an unmarried man. But Franklin, I have lost everything. My family, my possessions, my plans for the future. All I have left is my life, which you saved. And if I am honest, I do not want to spend that life away from you." Franklin stood up from the table and moved to kneel beside her chair. He took her hands in his, feeling how small they were, how fragile she still was. "Margaret Anderson, I would be honored to have you stay," he said, "but not as a guest or a charity case. If you stay, I want you to stay as my wife. I know it is fast, I know we have not known each other long, but I am certain of this. I am certain of you." Margaret let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Are you proposing to me, Franklin Hayes?" "I am," Franklin said. "I know I do not have much to offer. Just this cabin and my name and my promise to care for you for the rest of my days. But if that is enough, if I am enough, then yes, I am asking you to marry me." "You are more than enough," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face now. "You are everything." "Yes, Franklin. Yes, I will marry you." Franklin stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her gently, mindful of how fragile she still was. She pressed her face against his chest, and he felt her tears soaking through his shirt. He stroked her hair and held her until she stopped crying, until her breathing steadied and she pulled back to look up at him. "When?" she asked. "As soon as you are ready," Franklin said. "As soon as you are strong enough." "I am strong enough now," Margaret insisted. Franklin smiled and shook his head. "Give it another month at least. Let yourself heal completely. Let winter start to set in, and then when you are sure, when you are truly well, we will go down to Oatman and find a preacher." Margaret nodded, seeing the wisdom in this. "Another month," she agreed. "But Franklin, can I ask you something? Anything?" "Will you kiss me?" Franklin's breath caught. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks, and then he lowered his head and kissed her softly. Her lips were warm and soft, and she tasted like the honey from their dinner. The kiss was gentle and sweet and perfect, and when they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. That night, Margaret slept in the bed as always, and Franklin slept in his bedroll by the fire as he had been doing since she arrived. But something had changed between them, a bond forged not just by necessity but by choice, by love. Over the following month, Margaret continued to grow stronger. Franklin continued to cook every meal for her, slowly increasing the portions as her appetite returned. He made hearty breakfasts of eggs and bacon and biscuits with gravy. He made thick sandwiches for lunch with bread he baked himself. He made elaborate dinners of roasted meat and vegetables and rich desserts like apple pie and bread pudding. Margaret began to put on weight, her face filling out, her arms and legs losing that skeletal appearance. Color returned to her cheeks, and her hair, which she washed regularly now, regained its shine and luster. She looked healthy and vibrant, and Franklin found himself constantly amazed by her transformation. They spent their days working together around the cabin. Franklin taught Margaret how to preserve meat, how to prepare animal hides, how to chop wood and maintain the fire. Margaret taught Franklin how to do finer mending, how to organize the cabin more efficiently, how to make the space feel more like a home. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk for hours. Margaret told Franklin about her childhood in Missouri, about her parents and her dreams before they died. Franklin told Margaret about Texas, about learning to ride and rope from his father, about the vast open spaces and the big sky. They also talked about the future, about what their life together might look like. Franklin wanted to expand the cabin, to add a second room and eventually more if they had children. Margaret wanted to start a garden in the spring, to maybe get some goats for milk and cheese. They made plans and dreamed together, building a future one conversation at a time. As November arrived and the first snows began to fall, Margaret announced that she was ready. "Ready for what?" Franklin asked, though he knew. "Ready to marry you," Margaret said. "I am well now, Franklin." "Completely well, and I do not want to wait any longer." Franklin looked at her, seeing the truth of her words in her healthy glow and bright eyes. She had gained back the weight she had lost and then some, and she looked beautiful and strong. "Then we will go to Oatman tomorrow," he said. "If the weather holds." The weather did hold, and the next morning they made the journey down to Oatman together. This time, Margaret rode with confidence, and she did not tire on the journey. When they arrived in town, they went straight to the small church at the edge of the settlement. The preacher was an elderly man named Reverend Thomas, who had been serving the spiritual needs of Oatman and the surrounding area for nearly 10 years. He was surprised to see Franklin, who had never been much for church, but he welcomed them warmly. "We would like to be married," Franklin said simply. Reverend Thomas looked between them, taking in their serious expressions and the way they stood close together, Margaret's hand in Franklin's. "This is rather sudden, is it not?" the Reverend asked. "I do not believe I have seen you two together before." Franklin explained briefly about finding Margaret and caring for her. He did not mention the massacre, just that she had been ill and alone. Reverend Thomas listened carefully, his old eyes shrewd and kind. "And you are certain about this?" He asked Margaret. "You are not being coerced or pressured?" "I am certain," Margaret said firmly. "Franklin saved my life, but that is not why I want to marry him. I want to marry him because he is good and kind and I love him." "And you, Mr. Hayes?" the Reverend asked. "I love her," Franklin said simply. "I want to spend my life with her." Reverend Thomas smiled. "Well then, I suppose I had better marry you. Do you have witnesses?" They did not, but Martha and George Hendricks happened to be at the church, preparing for Sunday service, and they eagerly agreed to stand as witnesses. Martha fussed over Margaret's dress, which was the same one Franklin had bought for her weeks ago, but which she had cleaned and pressed until it looked almost new. The ceremony was simple, but heartfelt. Franklin and Margaret stood before Reverend Thomas and recited their vows, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. Franklin's voice was steady and sure, and Margaret's was clear and strong. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Franklin kissed Margaret with a tenderness that made Martha dab at her eyes with her handkerchief. After the ceremony, Martha insisted on throwing together a small celebration. She brought out cake and coffee, and a few other townspeople who heard about the wedding stopped by to offer their congratulations. It was modest but warm, and Margaret found herself smiling and laughing more than she had in months. As the sun began to set, Franklin and Margaret said their goodbyes and began the journey back up the mountain. This time, they rode side by side, husband and wife, partners in all things. When they reached the cabin, Franklin dismounted and then lifted Margaret down from her horse. Instead of setting her on her feet, he carried her to the door of the cabin. "What are you doing?" Margaret laughed. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," Franklin said, kicking the door open and carrying her inside. He set her down gently and they stood in the firelight, looking at each other. The cabin was the same as it had always been, but everything was different now. This was not just Franklin's cabin anymore. This was their home. That night, for the first time, they shared the bed together as husband and wife. Franklin was gentle and patient, mindful of everything Margaret had been through. Margaret was nervous but trusting, and together they discovered the intimacy of marriage, the physical expression of the love they had built over the past months. Afterwards, they lay wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the wind howl outside and the fire crackle in the hearth. "Are you happy?" Franklin asked, stroking Margaret's hair. "I am happier than I thought I could ever be again," Margaret said honestly. "After the massacre, I thought my life was over. I thought I would die in those woods, alone and afraid. But you found me, Franklin. You saved me, and you gave me a reason to live again." "You saved me too," Franklin said quietly. "I just did not know I needed saving." They fell asleep that way, tangled together under the quilts, and Franklin slept more soundly than he had in years. The winter that followed was hard, as mountain winters always are. The snow piled high around the cabin, sometimes reaching the windows. The temperature dropped so low that the water in the wash basin would freeze overnight. But inside the cabin, Franklin and Margaret were warm and safe and happy. Franklin continued to cook for Margaret, though now she often cooked alongside him. They worked together to make bread, stews, roasts, and desserts. Franklin taught Margaret his recipes, and Margaret added her own touches, things she had learned from her mother and aunt. Their meals became a collaboration, a blend of their different experiences and tastes. They also talked more deeply about what had happened to Margaret. On the long winter nights, when the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, Margaret would sometimes wake from nightmares, crying out for her aunt or the children. Franklin would hold her and let her talk about that terrible day, about the guilt she felt for surviving when they had not. "It is not your fault," Franklin would tell her over and over. "You did what you had to do to survive. There is no shame in that." "But why me?" Margaret would ask. "Why did I live when they all died? I do not know," Franklin would answer honestly. "But I am grateful every day that you did. And I believe that you have a purpose, Margaret. You survived for a reason." Slowly, over the long winter months, Margaret began to heal emotionally as well as physically. The nightmares became less frequent. She could talk about her family without crying. She could even smile when remembering the good times before the massacre. As winter turned to spring, the snow began to melt and the world came back to life. Margaret was eager to start her garden, and Franklin helped her clear a plot of land near the cabin and build raised beds. They planted vegetables and herbs, and Margaret tended them daily with a care and attention that Franklin found endearing. In May, Margaret realized she was pregnant. She told Franklin one evening after dinner, her voice nervous and excited all at once. "I think I am going to have a baby," she said. Franklin stared at her for a moment, the words not quite processing. Then a slow smile spread across his face, growing wider until he was grinning like a fool. "A baby," he repeated. "We are going to have a baby." Margaret nodded, tears of happiness streaming down her face. "I am almost certain. All the signs are there." Franklin pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "A baby," he said again, marveling at the word. "Margaret, you have made me the happiest man alive." That night, they made plans for the new addition to their family. Franklin would need to expand the cabin before winter came again, to add a proper bedroom and a nursery. They would need a cradle and baby clothes and 100 other things. But Franklin was not worried. He had months to prepare, and he would make sure everything was ready for their child. Over the summer, Franklin worked tirelessly on the cabin expansion. With help from a few men in Oatman, he added 2 new rooms, one for them and one for the baby. Margaret sewed baby clothes and blankets, her hands flying over the fabric as she prepared for their child's arrival. In September, nearly a year after Franklin had found Margaret dying in the woods, Margaret gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The birth was long and difficult, and Franklin spent the entire time pacing outside the bedroom door while Martha Hendricks, who had come up to help with the delivery, tended to Margaret inside. When he finally heard the baby's cry, Franklin nearly broke down the door in his rush to get inside. Margaret lay exhausted in the bed, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, but she was smiling as Martha placed the baby in her arms. "A son," Martha announced. "A healthy, beautiful baby boy." Franklin approached the bed slowly, almost reverently. He looked down at the tiny red-faced infant in Margaret's arms, and he felt his heart expand with a love so fierce it almost hurt. "He is perfect," Franklin whispered. "He looks like you," Margaret said, smiling up at her husband. They named him Thomas, after the reverend who had married them, but they called him Tommy. He had Franklin's dark hair and Margaret's honey-colored eyes, and from the moment he was born, he was the center of their world. Franklin had thought he understood love before. He loved Margaret with a depth and intensity that still sometimes surprised him. But the love he felt for his son was different, primal and protective, and all-consuming. He would have died for this child without a second thought, would have moved mountains to keep him safe and happy. Margaret was a natural mother, despite her fears that she would not know what to do. She nursed Tommy and sang to him and seemed to understand instinctively what he needed. And Franklin, who had never held a baby before in his life, learned quickly how to change diapers and soothe crying and rock Tommy to sleep. They settled into a new routine, one that revolved around their son. Franklin still cooked most of the meals, often with Tommy strapped to his chest in a sling Margaret had made so the baby could be close to them while they worked. Margaret tended her garden and the house, always with Tommy nearby in his cradle. The first year of Tommy's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and joyful days. He was a happy baby, quick to smile and laugh, and watching him grow and learn was the greatest adventure either Franklin or Margaret had ever experienced. On a warm September day, exactly 1 year after Tommy's birth, Franklin and Margaret stood outside their cabin, looking out over the mountains. Tommy was napping inside, and they had a rare moment of quiet together. "You ever think about that day?" Margaret asked. "The day you found me?" "Sometimes," Franklin admitted. "I think about how close I came to not finding you, if I had gone a different direction, if I had not heard those men, if I had been just a little bit later." "I was ready to die," Margaret said quietly. "I had given up. I thought if I just closed my eyes and went to sleep, the pain would stop. But then I woke up here and you were there, and everything changed." Franklin took her hand and squeezed it. "I was alive before I found you," he said, "but I was not really living. You changed that, Margaret. You and Tommy, you gave me a reason to not just exist, but to truly live." Margaret leaned against him, and they stood together in the fading sunlight. Below them, the valley stretched out in shades of gold and green, the mountains rising on all sides like protective walls. "I am glad you found me," Margaret said. "I am glad you fed me every meal until I healed. I am glad you loved me when I did not even love myself anymore. I am glad for all of it, Franklin. Every single moment." "So am I," Franklin said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. Inside the cabin, Tommy began to cry and they both smiled. Margaret went inside to tend to him while Franklin checked on the horses. This was their life now, simple and full and good. This was everything. 2 years later, Margaret gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Rose. She had Margaret's auburn hair and Franklin's strong features, and she was as fierce and determined as her mother from the moment she entered the world. Tommy, now a rambunctious 3-year-old, was fascinated by his baby sister and insisted on helping with everything. Though his help often created more work than it saved, Franklin expanded the cabin again, adding a loft for the children and a proper kitchen. He had become known in Oatman as a skilled carpenter, as well as a trapper, and he occasionally took on building projects for people in town to supplement their income. Margaret had started selling vegetables and herbs from her garden at the trading post, and her preserves and pickles had become quite popular. Life was not always easy. There were hard winters when supplies ran low and everyone was on edge. There were illnesses and injuries and the 100 small crises that come with raising children in a remote mountain cabin. But through it all, Franklin and Margaret faced everything together, their love deepening with each challenge they overcame. When Tommy was 5 and Rose was 2, Franklin and Margaret made a decision that would change their lives once more. They decided to tell the authorities about the massacre. It had been weighing on Margaret for years, the knowledge that the men who had killed her family had never been brought to justice. She had nightmares about them still roaming free, potentially attacking other wagon trains, other innocent families. Finally, she told Franklin she could not keep silent anymore. Franklin contacted the territorial marshal, and a man named Daniel Shaw rode up to their cabin to take Margaret's statement. She told him everything she could remember about that day, about the voices of the men, about their descriptions as much as she had seen them, about the location of the massacre. Marshal Shaw listened carefully and took detailed notes. "I will do everything I can to find these men," he promised. "But Miss Anderson, I have to be honest with you. It has been almost 5 years. The trail is cold. They could be anywhere or they could be dead already." "I know," Margaret said, "but I need to try. Those people, my family, they deserve justice." Marshal Shaw nodded. "I understand. I will put out descriptions and see what I can find." 3 months later, Marshal Shaw returned with news. 2 of the men who matched the descriptions Margaret had given had been arrested in New Mexico territory for a similar crime. They had attacked a stagecoach and killed 2 passengers. When questioned, they had eventually confessed to several robberies and murders, including the wagon train massacre in Colorado. "They will hang," Marshal Shaw told Franklin and Margaret. "Justice will be served." Margaret cried when she heard the news, but they were tears of relief. It would not bring her family back, but knowing that the men who had killed them would face consequences gave her a sense of closure she had not known she needed. As the years passed, Franklin and Margaret's family continued to grow. Margaret gave birth to another son, whom they named James, and then another daughter, whom they named Sarah. The cabin was full of noise and laughter and life, a far cry from the silent, solitary existence Franklin had once lived. Franklin still cooked most of the meals, though now he had help from Margaret and increasingly from the children as they got older. Tommy learned to make biscuits that were almost as good as his father's. Rose had a talent for desserts and made pies that the whole family loved. Even little James and Sarah helped where they could, stirring pots and setting the table. The ritual of sharing meals together became the cornerstone of their family life. No matter how busy they were, no matter what was happening, they always sat down together for dinner. It was during these meals that they talked about their days, shared their worries and joys, and strengthened the bonds that held them together. Margaret often thought back to those terrible days when she had been starving in the woods, when she had thought her life was over. And then she would look around at her beautiful family, at the life she and Franklin had built together, and she would feel overwhelmed with gratitude. "What are you thinking about?" Franklin would ask, seeing the emotion on her face. "Just how lucky I am," Margaret would reply. "How lucky we are." Franklin would smile and take her hand, and they would sit together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the family they had created. When Tommy turned 15, he began talking about wanting to learn his father's trade, to become a trapper and guide like Franklin. Franklin was proud but also cautious. He knew how hard and dangerous that life could be. "If that is what you truly want, I will teach you," Franklin told his son. "But you need to understand that it is not just about adventure and freedom. It is about hard work and responsibility and respecting the land and the animals." "I understand, Pa," Tommy said seriously. "I want to learn everything you can teach me." So Franklin began teaching Tommy the skills he would need. They spent long days in the mountains, checking trap lines and learning to read the signs of the forest. Franklin taught Tommy how to track animals, how to skin and preserve hides, how to survive in the wilderness with nothing but the tools on your belt and the knowledge in your head. Margaret watched her son grow into a capable young man with mixed feelings. She was proud of him, but she also worried. She knew the dangers that existed in these mountains, the bears and mountain lions and harsh weather that could kill a man if he was not careful. But she also trusted Franklin to teach Tommy well, to prepare him for whatever challenges he might face. Rose, meanwhile, showed an interest in medicine. She had a gentle touch with injured animals and sick siblings, and she was always asking questions about healing herbs and remedies. Margaret encouraged this interest, teaching Rose everything she knew about medicinal plants and natural treatments. They even made a trip to Denver one summer to visit a doctor who taught Rose more about proper medical techniques. James was the scholar of the family, always reading when he could get his hands on a book. Franklin and Margaret made sure to buy books whenever they went to town, building a small library in the cabin. James dreamed of becoming a lawyer or maybe even a politician, using words and laws to make the world a better place. And Sarah, the baby of the family, was a free spirit who loved the outdoors and had a special way with animals. She could calm a spooked horse with a few soft words, and had even befriended a family of foxes that lived in the woods near the cabin. Franklin and Margaret watched their children grow and develop into unique individuals with their own dreams and personalities, and they marveled at the family they had created. Each child was different, but all of them were loved fiercely and unconditionally. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Franklin surprised Margaret with a gift. He had been working on it in secret for months, carving and sanding and polishing until it was perfect. It was a wooden music box, beautifully crafted with intricate designs carved into the lid. When Margaret opened it, a soft melody played, and inside was a small piece of paper with words written in Franklin's careful handwriting. "To Margaret, who brought music back into my life, I love you more with each passing day. Forever yours, Franklin." Margaret cried as she read the note, holding the music box to her chest. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "You are beautiful, Franklin Hayes." They had a quiet celebration that night, just the two of them after the children had gone to bed. They sat by the fire and talked about the past 10 years, about all they had been through and all they had built together. "If I could go back and change what happened," Margaret said, "if I could save my family from that terrible day, I would. But I would not change finding you, Franklin. I would not change this life we have built. I would not change a thing," Franklin said, "except maybe I would find you sooner, spare you some of that suffering." "The suffering made me strong," Margaret said, "and it led me to you, so even that, I think, was worth it." They kissed in the firelight, their love as strong as it had ever been, deepened by years of partnership and parenthood and shared dreams. As the children grew older and began to leave home to pursue their own paths, Franklin and Margaret found themselves coming full circle. Tommy, at 18, took a position as a guide for hunting expeditions, using the skills his father had taught him. Rose went to study nursing in Denver, determined to bring proper medical care back to the mountain communities. James won a scholarship to a university in the East, his sharp mind and way with words earning him opportunities they had never dreamed possible. Only Sarah remained at home, and at 16, she was already talking about starting her own horse breeding operation, using the natural way she had with animals to build a business. Franklin and Margaret supported all of their children's dreams, even though it meant watching them leave the cabin and venture out into the wider world. It was bittersweet, seeing the nest empty little by little, but they were proud of the strong, capable adults their children had become. "We did well," Margaret said one evening as she and Franklin sat on the porch watching the sunset. Sarah was in the barn tending to the horses, giving them a moment of peace and quiet. "We did," Franklin agreed. "They are good people, all of them. They will make their marks on the world." "Do you ever miss the quiet?" Margaret asked, thinking of those early days when it had been just the two of them in the cabin. Franklin thought about it for a moment. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I would not trade what we have built for anything. This noise, this chaos, this life, it is everything I never knew I wanted." Margaret leaned against him, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. When Sarah finally left home at 19 to start her horse breeding business in partnership with a ranch down in the valley, Franklin and Margaret found themselves alone in the cabin for the first time in over 20 years. The quiet was strange at first. No children running through the house, no arguments to settle, no meals to prepare for a crowd. Just the two of them, like it had been at the very beginning, but they adapted as they always had. They rediscovered the rhythms of life as a couple, the simple pleasure of cooking a meal together just for the two of them, of going to bed when they wanted without worrying about children, of making love in the middle of the day just because they felt like it. They also began to travel more. They made trips to Denver to visit Rose and to the East to see James. They visited Tommy on his expeditions and Sarah at her ranch. They explored parts of Colorado they had never seen before, taking their time and enjoying the journey, but they always came back to the cabin in the mountains. It was their home, the place where their life together had truly begun, and they could not imagine living anywhere else. On a warm September day in 1899, Franklin and Margaret stood in the exact spot where Franklin had first brought Margaret after finding her in the woods 21 years earlier. They came to this spot every year on the anniversary of that day, a private ritual to remember how far they had come. 21 years, Margaret marveled. It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. Franklin wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. She fit perfectly against him, as she always had, though they were both older now, their hair showing streaks of silver, their faces lined with the years of work and laughter and life. "You are just as beautiful as you were that day," Franklin said. Margaret laughed. "I was half dead and covered in dirt that day." And still the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, Franklin insisted. They stood together in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees, holding each other and remembering. Margaret thought about the terrified, broken girl she had been, starving and alone and ready to give up. And then she thought about the woman she had become, strong and loved and surrounded by family. "Thank you," she whispered to Franklin. "Thank you for saving me. Thank you for feeding me every meal until I healed. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for this life." "Thank you for letting me," Franklin replied. "Thank you for choosing to stay, for choosing me, for building this beautiful life with me." They kissed there in the woods, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and had built something beautiful and lasting from that chance encounter. That evening, back at the cabin, Franklin cooked dinner as he had done thousands of times before. He made Margaret's favorite meal, roasted chicken with herbs from the garden she still tended, potatoes and carrots and fresh bread with butter. They ate by candlelight, talking and laughing, sharing memories and making new ones. After dinner, they sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. The night was clear and cool, the first hint of autumn in the air. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, and closer by, the horses whinnied softly in their pen. "Do you have any regrets?" Margaret asked, her head resting on Franklin's shoulder. Franklin thought about the question seriously. He thought about his life before Margaret, about the loneliness he had not even realized he felt. He thought about the hard times, the struggles, the moments of fear and worry. And then he thought about Margaret, about their children, about the life they had built together in these mountains. "Not a single one," he said firmly. "This life, this love, it is more than I ever dreamed possible. How could I regret any of it?" "Neither do I," Margaret said. "Even the terrible parts, because they led me here, to you, to this." They sat together under the stars, two souls who had found each other in the darkest of times and had built a love that would last forever. The mountain wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. Inside the cabin, the fire burned warm and bright, a beacon of home and hope. And outside, Franklin and Margaret held each other close, grateful for every moment, every meal, every memory they had shared. Their love story had started with an act of compassion, with one person finding another in desperate need and choosing to help. But it had grown into something far greater, a partnership built on mutual respect and care and a deep, abiding love that had weathered every storm. As they finally went inside for the night, Franklin took Margaret's hand and looked into her eyes, those honey-colored eyes that had captured his heart 21 years ago and had never let go. "I love you, Margaret Hayes," he said. "I love you, Franklin Hayes," she replied. And in that moment, in that simple exchange of words they had said thousands of times before, was the truth of their lives together. A truth built on love and kindness, and the simple act of feeding someone who was starving, not just for food but for hope and connection, and a reason to live. They had saved each other, these two souls who had found each other in the wilderness. And they had built a life together that was rich and full and beautiful, a testament to the power of love and the strength of the human spirit. As they lay down together that night, wrapped in each other's arms as they had been for over 20 years, they knew with absolute certainty that they had found in each other everything they would ever need. The mountain cowboy who had learned to nurture and care, and the woman who had learned to hope and love again. Together, they were complete. The years that followed were gentle ones. Franklin and Margaret settled into the rhythms of older age with the same grace they had brought to every other stage of their lives together. They still worked the land, though not as vigorously as they once had. The garden remained Margaret's pride and joy, producing vegetables and herbs that she still sold at the trading post in Oatman, though now more as a hobby than a necessity. Franklin reduced his trapping and hunting, focusing more on carpentry and taking on projects that interested him rather than ones he needed for income. Their children, all now established in their own lives, made sure their parents never wanted for anything, sending money and supplies regularly. But the greatest joy of their later years came in the form of grandchildren. Tommy married a kind woman named Elizabeth and had 3 children. Rose married a doctor she met during her training and had 2 children. James married a fellow lawyer and had 1 daughter. And Sarah married a rancher and had 4 children who were as wild and free-spirited as their mother. Franklin and Margaret's cabin became a gathering place for the growing family, especially during summers and holidays. The sounds of children's laughter once again filled the rooms, and Margaret taught her grandchildren the same lessons she had taught her own children about kindness and resilience and love. Franklin, for his part, taught the grandchildren to cook. He would lift the smallest ones onto stools so they could reach the counter, and he would guide their hands as they learned to knead bread or stir soup. Cooking, he told them, was an act of love, a way of caring for the people who mattered to you. The grandchildren adored their grandfather, and they would beg him to tell them stories about the old days, about living in the mountains and trapping and hunting. But the story they loved most was the story of how he had found their grandmother in the woods. Franklin would always look at Margaret when he told this story, and she would smile back at him, and the love between them was so palpable that even the children could feel it. "Your grandmother was the bravest person I ever met," Franklin would tell them. "She survived something terrible, something that would have broken most people. But she did not break. She healed and she built a beautiful life. She is the strongest person I know." And Margaret would shake her head and say, "Your grandfather saved my life. He fed me every meal and cared for me when I could not care for myself. He gave me a reason to live again. He is the kindest person I know." The grandchildren would listen wide-eyed, understanding even at their young ages that what their grandparents shared was special and rare. One spring day, when Franklin was 72 and Margaret was 68, they took a walk together through the woods. It was a beautiful day, the kind that made you grateful to be alive, with wildflowers blooming and birds singing in the trees. They walked slowly, their pace adjusted to match their older bodies, but they still held hands as they had always done. They came to a clearing they both recognized, the place where Franklin had first found Margaret all those years ago. "You remember?" Franklin asked. "I remember everything," Margaret said. "I remember being so scared and so tired. I remember thinking I was going to die. And then I remember opening my eyes and seeing your face, and somehow I knew I was going to be all right." "I knew it too," Franklin said. "From the moment I saw you, I knew my life was about to change. I just did not know how much." They stood together in the clearing, remembering and reflecting on all the years that had passed since that fateful day. So much had happened, so much joy and love and life. 4 children, 12 grandchildren at last count, and a love that had only grown stronger with time. "If I had one wish," Margaret said softly, "it would be that everyone could know a love like ours. That everyone could know what it feels like to be cherished and cared for the way you have cherished and cared for me." "That is a beautiful wish," Franklin said, pulling her close. "And you have given me the same gift, Margaret. You have made my life full and meaningful in ways I never imagined possible." They walked back to the cabin together, taking their time, enjoying the sunshine and the fresh air and each other's company. When they arrived home, Franklin made them lunch, a simple meal of soup and bread, but made with the same care and attention he had always brought to cooking. As they ate together, Margaret looked around the cabin, taking in all the little details that made it home. The quilt she had sewn hanging on the wall, the rocking chair Franklin had built when she was pregnant with Tommy, the photographs of their children and grandchildren arranged on the mantel, the music box Franklin had given her for their 10th anniversary, still sitting in a place of honor on the side table. "We built a good life here," she said. "We did," Franklin agreed. "The best life." They spent the afternoon sitting on the porch, watching the clouds drift by and talking about their children and grandchildren. They made plans for the upcoming summer when the whole family would gather for a reunion. They talked about the garden and what vegetables to plant this year. They talked about everything and nothing, the comfortable conversation of two people who had spent a lifetime together. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Franklin turned to Margaret and took her hand. "I would do it all again," he said suddenly. "Every moment, every challenge, every joy. I would choose you every single time, Margaret." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "And I would choose you," she said. "Forever and always, Franklin, you are my home." They sat together as darkness fell, wrapped in the blanket of night and the warmth of their love. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled merrily, and the smell of the bread Franklin had baked earlier lingered in the air. This was their life, built from nothing, from a chance encounter in the woods and a choice to care, to feed, to nurture, to love. It was a life full of purpose and meaning, a life that had touched not just each other but their children and grandchildren and everyone who had ever known them. Franklin and Margaret lived several more years in their mountain cabin, growing old together with grace and gratitude. They were blessed with even more grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren, and their family continued to grow and thrive, carrying forward the lessons of love and kindness that Franklin and Margaret had taught them. When Franklin finally passed away at the age of 78, it was peacefully in his sleep, with Margaret beside him as she had been for over 50 years. Margaret held his hand and whispered words of love to him until his last breath, and though her heart broke at losing him, she was grateful for every single moment they had shared. She lived another 3 years without him, cared for by her children, and surrounded by the family they had created together. She spent her days tending her garden and cooking the recipes Franklin had taught her, keeping his memory alive in every meal she prepared. And when Margaret's time came, she went peacefully as well, with her children gathered around her. Her last words were of Franklin, and those who were there swore that, as she took her final breath, she smiled as if she could see him waiting for her. They were buried side by side on the mountain they had loved so much, under the trees where their story had begun. Their grave was marked with a simple stone that read, "Franklin and Margaret Hayes." They found each other in the wilderness and built a love that lasted forever. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would visit that grave for generations to come, bringing flowers in the spring and telling stories of the mountain cowboy who had found a starving woman in the woods and fed her every meal until she healed, and how that simple act of compassion had blossomed into a love story for the ages. The cabin still stands on that Colorado mountainside, maintained by the family as a monument to Franklin and Margaret's love. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind whispers through the aspen trees, you can almost hear the echo of laughter and smell the scent of fresh bread baking, as if Franklin and Margaret are still there, still together, still loving each other the way they always had. Their story became a legend in Oatman and the surrounding areas, passed down through generations as a reminder that even in the darkest times, even when all seems lost, love can find a way. That one act of kindness can change everything. That choosing to care for another person, to feed them not just physically but emotionally and spiritually, can create something beautiful and lasting. Franklin and Margaret Hayes had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. Two broken souls who had healed each other and built a life full of love and purpose. Their legacy lived on in their descendants, in the values they had instilled, in the love they had demonstrated every single day of their lives together. And so their story ends not with sadness but with celebration, with gratitude for a love well lived and a life well loved. They had found each other in the wilderness, and together they had created a home, a family, and a love that would echo through the generations, inspiring all who heard their tale to choose kindness, to choose compassion, and to choose love, always love in all things.